200 years ago, Britain had been almost continuously at war with France over a century. In the early 1800s, faced by the threat of invasion by Napoleon, 74 small forts called Martello towers were built along the south coast. Between 1812 and 1816, a further chain of 29 forts was built along the east coast. These East Coast Martello towers were larger and more powerful than the originals, and together created a formidable integrated defence line. They covered all the vulnerable beaches between Clacton and Aldborough, armed with a 24-pounder anti-ship cannon facing out to sea, and two man-killing 18-pounder howitzers firing up and down the beaches. Their role was to stop any invasion before it ever got ashore, or failing that, to hold the line for long enough for the main field army to arrive and destroy the enemy in battle. They were named after a tower at Martello Point in Corsica, which held out against an assault by a Royal Navy battleship and a frigate for 2 long days in 1794. The design of the fort was too good not to copy. The only entrance was on the first floor, facing the land, reached by a ladder that could be pulled up in an emergency. The last of the East Coast Martellos was actually completed in 1816, after the war was over. Here though, we're showing one as if getting ready for battle, so you can see what they were like inside. The garrison of about 20 artillerymen lived nearby, and would have only manned the tower when invasion threatened. Like modern soldiers, most of their time would have been spent waiting. Only the officer in command had his own room. Everyone else was crowded together in a common mess. We don't know if the garrison would have had muskets. Artillerymen usually didn't. We've shown them here though, as some kind of small arms would have been essential to defend the fort if the enemy ever got close enough to try to break in. The weight of the roof with its cannons is carried by a huge internal brick column, which effectively makes the whole fort one big circular arch. It's immensely strong. The gunpowder was kept in the magazine, a special room in the basement. No naked lights were allowed there. Instead, the room was lit from the outside, through a special internal window called the magazine light. The troops had folding beds, the only way to cram everyone into such a small space. The stairways to the roof were inside the 2.5-metre thick walls. Each Martello tower contained 700,000 bricks and cost about £7,000, £43 million in today's money. They were each built by a local contractor, so despite the standard design, the details vary slightly. The small dip in the middle of the roof is a drain that collects rainwater and stores it in a cistern in the basement. Having a supply of fresh water inside the fort would have been essential in a siege. The guns were mounted on wooden carriages, each with a 180-degree arc of fire. The actual pivots were made of old gun barrels embedded upright in the stone roof. Set into the walls were ready-use ammunition lockers to hold cannonballs, shells, and gunpowder. In action, there would be no time to haul heavy ammunition up from the basement. The 18-pound howitzers fired an explosive shrapnel shell up to 1,000 meters or so. Shells were hollow iron spheres with thin, brittle casings filled with gunpowder and exploded by a fuse that lit when the gun was fired. The howitzer commander cut the fuse to the right length so that the shell would explode more or less as it arrived on target. The howitzer shell then blew up into jagged metal shards that flew as far as 75 meters away, shredding anything they hit. Martellos were built as a chain of forts, with overlapping fields of fire from their howitzers covering all the accessible beaches. Any enemy troops landing anywhere along the east coast could therefore be hit with explosive shells before they'd even got out of their boats. The towers might take days to subdue, and all the while, shells would be raining down on the invasion. The beach would have become one big killing ground. The chimneys would have got in the way of the guns during battle. Every Martello therefore had a sledgehammer, and one of the soldiers' first jobs in an attack was to knock the chimneys down. Although there was only one 24-pounder cannon, which pointed out to sea, it was mounted on a fixed carriage and was far more accurate than any ship's gun. It had an effective range of 1,000 meters or so. 24-pounder refers to the weight of the solid iron shot, equivalent to about 14 kilograms. Each shot was propelled by 2 kilograms or more of gunpowder. The cannonball could penetrate more than 15 centimeters of ship's timbers, creating a lethal storm of high-velocity splinters as it did so. The gun barrel alone weighed about 2.5 tons, and it needed a crew of 10 or so men to load and aim the gun. Like the howitzers, it took them around 2 minutes to reload between shots. 200 years ago, the new chain of Martello towers along the east coast was as ambitious, controversial, and expensive as Trident is today. And as with Britain's nuclear deterrent, none of the Martello tower forts ever fired a shot in anger. Did they have a genuine military purpose, or were they really to reassure the public and convince our enemies of Britain's will to fight? It could be argued that the fact they never saw action is proof that they worked. The chain of Martello towers was the ultimate deterrent of the early 19th century. Most Martello towers were abandoned soon after they were finished. The war with France was finally over. Some were used by customs officers, or had their guns updated as war scares came and went. A few were retained by the military as signal stations. Most were simply left to decay. When World War II came in 1939, Britain was woefully underprepared. Just as in 1914, the British Army was sent to fight on the continent. But this time, the Germans proved unstoppable. In May 1940, the core of the British Army was rescued from Dunkirk, but it left nearly all its equipment behind. A month later, France had surrendered, and Britain and the Commonwealth stood alone. With Hitler threatening to invade, and the army short of everything needed to fight a modern war, the East Coast was once again in the front line. All along the coast, the troops dug in and prepared to defend the beaches with whatever arms they could find. The old Martello towers were hastily pressed into service as lookouts and strongpoints. After more than 100 years, the Martellos had no furniture, no windows, and no internal walls left. They must have been very bleak postings, especially when the cold east wind whipped in from the sea. This scene is set in late summer 1940, when the Martellos would have been occupied by regular army soldiers, either back from France or newly recruited. This was the height of the invasion threat, and the defences would have been permanently manned. A small concrete shelter was built to protect sentries from the worst of the weather. It would also have given some cover against machine gunning by passing aircraft. In a modern war, though, the Martellos were extremely vulnerable to attacks by bombers, and the roof was the weakest point. Short of heavy weapons, lacking adequate artillery support, the soldiers would have been relying on the RAF and Royal Navy to stop any invasion before it ever reached them. If the Germans had landed successfully, the Martellos would have become death traps. Fortunately for everyone, by the winter of 1940, the risk of invasion had passed, and the towers reverted to their traditional role as lookouts. Today, several towers have been demolished or lost to the sea, and most of the rest have been converted to holiday homes. But in Felixstowe and Aldborough, or between Bordsey and Shingle Street, the huge bulk of the surviving Martello towers still stand guard over the coast, a reminder of when Suffolk was in the front line against a potential invasion.